All right, let's dive into a stark warning. We're going to explore a hypothetical scenario. What if India's entire supply of cooking gas, LPG, was just suddenly cut off? Now, the story we're about to see is fictional, but it raises some absolutely critical questions about energy security that are very, very real. So, the source material we're looking at kicks things off with this incredibly powerful human story. And it's really meant to set the scene. Just picture this. A 66-year-old man standing for hours and hours in the heat, all for just one gas cylinder. I mean, it's a gut-wrenching image, right? It immediately takes this big abstract idea of a crisis and makes it personal, makes it tragically real. Okay, so let's be super clear here. The story of Mr. Middle, it's part of a fictional what-if scenario that the source created to make a really important point. But the question it forces all of us to ask is a serious one. Just how vulnerable is a country's energy supply? So for the rest of this explainer, we're going to walk through this exact scenario, just as the source lays it all out. All right, so we've seen the individual tragedy, but the source then zooms out and it paints this picture of what a nationwide shortage would actually feel like. And trust me, the effects wouldn't just be isolated incidents. We're talking about a ripple effect, a domino effect, that would touch every single part of society. And in this scenario, things unravel fast, shockingly fast. You've got hundreds of people queuing up for just one cylinder. The economic hit is immediate. We're talking 20 to 30% of restaurants just shutting their doors. Food delivery orders, they plummet by 50, even 60%. And when people get desperate, well, you see crime. Trucks get looted, gas agencies are stormed, a black market pops up where cylinders are going for 6 times the normal price. It gets so bad that gas trucks actually need police protection just to make their deliveries. So, the big question is, how? How could a massive modern economy be brought to its knees like this? Well, the source argues that you can trace it all back to one single critical vulnerability, a single point of failure, a geographical choke point that basically holds India's entire energy supply in its grip. And that weak link, that single point of failure the source identifies, it's the Strait of Hormuz. It's this narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman, and it just so happens to be one of the most critical shipping lanes on the entire planet. Okay, so to really get the scale of the problem, you got to understand this number first. A full 60% of all the cooking gas used in India is imported. It's not made at home. It has to be shipped in from other countries. That's a huge reliance on the outside world, right? And here's where it gets really crazy. Of that huge 60% that's imported, a staggering 90% of it, 90%, has to pass through that one tiny 33-kilometer wide strait, the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, think about that. Almost the entire imported supply is squeezed through one single bottleneck. So here's the kicker. What happens if that bottleneck gets shut down? Well, according to the source, India's strategic reserve of LPG would last for just 2 days. 48 hours. Let that sink in. For a country of 1.4 billion people, the backup supply is practically zero. If those ships stop coming, the gas runs out. Period. Now, in the middle of this hypothetical crisis, the source points out this huge disconnect. It's like you're getting two completely different stories. On one side, you've got the official government statements, and on the other, you've got what people are actually seeing on the ground, and frankly, what the government itself is doing. So here's the official line, according to the scenario in the source material. The government comes out and reassures everyone. They say, hey, domestic supply is totally protected. There is no shortage. They claim any problems are just because people are panic buying and hoarding, not because there's a real lack of gas. But then, the source says, you gotta look at what's actually happening. If there's really no shortage, then why? Why raise the price of a domestic cylinder by 60 rupees? Why start rationing commercial supply, cutting it by a massive 80%? Why make people wait 25, even 45 days between cylinder bookings? And this is a big one. Why suddenly allow restaurants to start burning coal and kerosene? The actions just don't seem to line up with the words. They tell a very different story. And this brings us to the core argument from the source material. The idea is that this whole hypothetical crisis, it wasn't some random, out-of-the-blue disaster. No, it was the predictable result of years of failures in planning and policy. The critique is pretty straightforward. The source argues that, for years, there was this massive over-reliance on just one import route. It claims there was no real push to build up a strategic reserve for LPG, like the one that exists for petroleum. geopolitical red flags, warnings of a potential conflict that could close the strait, allegedly ignored. And then, when the crisis actually hits in this scenario, the source says there was a whole week of nothing, a week of inaction before there was any official response. Okay, so we're deep in this hypothetical crisis. The focus naturally shifts to what's next. How does this all end? And maybe more importantly, what can regular people do to get by? The source lays out a few potential ways this could all play out. So the source gives us 4 main geopolitical scenarios. 1, a ceasefire. Peace is negotiated, the conflict ends, the strait reopens. 2, alternative supply. Emergency shipments start arriving from places like the US, Norway, Canada, and Russia. But the source is quick to point out that this is often just a drop in the bucket, sometimes only enough for a single day's needs. 3, the strait is reopened by force, without a ceasefire. And 4, India manages to negotiate a special exemption, where Iran lets Indian ships pass through. As you can see, all of these are pretty complex, and there are no guarantees. So, putting all the complex politics aside, what's the realistic timeline here? Well, the source offers a pretty sobering estimate. They figure the shortage would last for a minimum of 4 to 8 more weeks. That's a long, tough road ahead for everyone. The source then switches gears to give some practical advice for everyday people caught in this mess. It says if you have reliable electricity, switch to an induction cooker. If piped natural gas, or PNG, is an option in your area, sign up for it, since that supply doesn't depend on the Strait of Hormuz. It also really encourages people to report any black market sellers to the consumer helpline, and, this is so important, to avoid panic buying. Hoarding extra cylinders just makes a bad situation even worse for everybody. But ultimately, the explainer brings us back to what is maybe the most tragic consequence of all. You see, after years and years of progress, of government programs bringing clean cooking fuel to millions, a crisis like this would force women in rural India right back to square one. It means they're back to cooking on unhealthy wood and dung-fired stoves, breathing in all that smoke. They end up paying the highest price for this kind of failure. And so, the source material leaves us with this one, final, really important question. It makes you think about that whole complex web of geopolitics, infrastructure, and planning that keeps our homes running. So, is a nation's energy security a guarantee? Is it something we can just take for granted? Or is it a hope, something that has to be constantly fought for, protected, and secured?